The wind howled like a wounded beast against the fragile wooden structure of the cabin. Elias sat by the dying fire, the meager flames casting long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn log walls. He was miles from civilization, nestled deep within the dense embrace of a forest that seemed to stretch on into eternity. This was supposed to be a retreat, a brief respite from the suffocating pressures of his daily life. Instead, it had become a prison of his own making, a solitary confinement dictated by the unforgiving elements of a sudden, brutal blizzard. In the days leading up to his fateful decision, Elias had felt a profound sense of detachment. The bustling city streets, usually a source of energy, had become a cacophony of meaningless noise. He was an architect, a man who designed spaces for people to live, work, and connect. Yet, he felt profoundly disconnected from the very structures he created. His marriage with Sarah had been straining under the weight of his unexplainable melancholy. She had suggested therapy, a vacation together, anything to bridge the growing chasm between them. But Elias, in his stubborn pride, believed that all he needed was silence. He craved the absence of expectation, the void where the demands of the world could not reach him. He found the listing for the remote cabin in a dusty, forgotten corner of an online rental site. It promised absolute seclusion, a rustic retreat surrounded by hundreds of acres of untouched wilderness. It was exactly what he was looking for, or so he thought. The drive up had been a journey into the heart of isolation. As the paved roads gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to dirt, Elias felt the oppressive weight of civilization lifting from his shoulders. The towering pines, ancient and silent, stood like sentinels guarding a forgotten realm. When he finally arrived at the cabin, it was a picture of rustic charm. Built of heavy, weathered logs, it sat in a small clearing, surrounded by a sea of green. Inside, it was sparsely furnished, smelling of pine needles and old wood smoke. For the first 2 days, it was paradise. He chopped wood, read old paperbacks by the fire, and listened to the profound, unbroken silence of the forest. He felt his mind beginning to clear, the tangled knots of his anxiety slowly unraveling. But then the weather changed. The sky, previously a brilliant, unblemished blue, bruised into a deep, angry purple. The temperature plummeted and the first flakes of snow began to fall. At first it was beautiful, a serene winter wonderland. But the snow didn't stop. It fell with a relentless mechanical efficiency, burying the world in a cold, white shroud. By the morning of the 3rd day, the dirt road was impassable. Elias was trapped. He tried the old rotary phone on the wall, but the line was dead, the rhythmic hum replaced by a hollow, terrifying silence. His cell phone, naturally, had no signal. He was completely cut off from the outside world. The realization of his true isolation didn't hit him all at once. It crept in slowly, a creeping dread that seeped into his bones alongside the cold. He was entirely dependent on himself. If he fell and broke his leg, no one would come. If the firewood ran out, he would freeze. And if someone or something was out there in the woods with him, he was utterly defenseless. It started with the footprints. On the second morning of the storm, when the snowfall had paused momentarily, Elias ventured outside to gather firewood from the shed. The air was crisp, biting at his exposed skin, and the silence of the snow-covered landscape was absolute. But as he trudged back towards the cabin, his arms laden with split logs, he saw them. A set of deep, purposeful impressions in the pristine snow, circling the perimeter of the cabin. They didn't belong to any animal. They were unmistakably human, the heavy treads of large boots pressing deep into the drifts. A cold dread knotted in his stomach, heavier than the wood he carried. He followed the tracks with his eyes, watching them disappear into the thick line of pines at the edge of the clearing. Someone had been watching him. Someone was out there, in the freezing cold, observing his every move. He hurried back inside, bolting the heavy wooden door behind him. He checked the windows, ensuring they were all securely locked, though the thin panes of glass offered little comfort against the vast unknown outside. The feeling of isolation, once a source of peace, now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. That night the storm returned with a vengeance. The wind shrieked, battering the cabin with an intensity that rattled the very foundations. Elias huddled under a thick woolen blanket, an iron poker clutched tightly in his hand. Every creak of the timber, every whistle of the wind sounded like a footstep, a whisper, a threat. When the sun finally set, plunging the woods into an inky, impenetrable darkness, the true psychological torment began. The silence of the forest, once comforting, was now menacing. Every sound was amplified, distorted by fear. The wind howling through the eaves sounded like a chorus of damned souls. The settling of the logs sounded like footsteps on the porch. Elias sat in the center of the room, his eyes darting frantically from shadow to shadow, his heart pounding a frantic, exhausting rhythm against his ribs. Then the power went out. The sudden transition from the warm, artificial light to absolute darkness was shocking, a physical blow that left him gasping for air. He fumbled in the dark, his hands trembling violently, until he found a box of matches. He lit a single candle, its feeble flame casting monstrous, undulating shadows on the walls. It was in this flickering half-light that the real nightmare began. Thump. It was soft, barely audible over the wind, but distinct. It came from the porch. Someone was standing right outside the door. Elias' heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He tightened his grip on the poker, his palms slick with cold sweat. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He waited, trapped in a paralyzing web of fear. Minutes stretched into eternity. The silence from the porch was agonizing. Then, the doorknob slowly, deliberately began to turn. It clicked, caught by the deadbolt, but the pressure continued, a steady, relentless force trying to breach his sanctuary. "Who's there?" Elias called out, his voice trembling, betraying his terror. "I'm armed, I have a gun." It was a lie, a desperate bluff, but it was all he had. The turning stopped, the pressure ceased. For a moment, Elias allowed himself a fraction of hope. Perhaps they had left, perhaps they believed him. But the hope was shattered by the sound of shattering glass. It didn't come from the front door. It came from the kitchen at the back of the cabin. Panic exploded in Elias' chest. He stumbled through the darkness, his shins bumping against unseen furniture, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached the doorway to the kitchen just in time to see a massive silhouette climbing through the broken window, the storm swirling behind them like a dark aura. The masked figure in the kitchen was a manifestation of all his darkest fears. The burlap sack, crude and terrifying, hid any trace of humanity, transforming the intruder into a faceless, unstoppable monster. The hunting knife, glinting in the faint light, was a promise of pain and death. Elias didn't wait. He turned and bolted, scrambling up the narrow wooden staircase that led to the loft. The heavy, measured footsteps of the intruder followed, a terrifying rhythm of impending doom. He reached the loft, a small, cramped space under the eaves, and slammed the trapdoor shut, dragging a heavy trunk over it to bar the way. He huddled in the corner, his knees pulled tightly to his chest, the poker raised in a desperate defensive posture. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. The silence returned, thicker, more oppressive than before. The intruder was playing with him, a cat toying with a mouse before the final, bloody strike. "Why are you doing this?" Elias sobbed, the words tearing from his throat. "Please, just take what you want and leave." A low, grating chuckle echoed up the stairwell, a sound devoid of humanity, devoid of mercy. It was the sound of a predator acknowledging its prey. The impact against the trapdoor was sudden and violent. The wood splintered, the heavy trunk shifting slightly with the force of the blow. Elias screamed, scrambling further back into the corner, his mind fractured by terror. Another blow, and another. The trapdoor groaned, the hinges straining, the wood bowing upward. The intruder was relentlessly, methodically breaking through. As the trapdoor splintered under the relentless blows, Elias experienced a strange, terrifying clarity. He saw his life stretching out behind him, a series of choices that had led him inexorably to this very moment. He had sought isolation, and he had found it in its purest, most horrifying form. He was about to die alone, miles from anyone who cared about him, at the hands of a nameless, faceless killer. The absolute pointlessness of it all was staggering. His life, his dreams, his struggles, they all amounted to nothing in the face of this brutal, primal violence. When the intruder finally broke through, Elias didn't beg for his life. The time for bargaining had passed. He fought, a desperate, feral struggle for survival. He kicked out blindly, his heavy boot connecting with the intruder's shin. The figure stumbled slightly, a grunt of surprise escaping from beneath the burlap sack. It was a small victory, a fleeting moment of defiance, but it was enough to buy Elias a fraction of a second. He rolled to the side, ignoring the agonizing pain in his head, and scrambled towards the pile of broken wood from the trapdoor. His hands closed around a large, jagged splinter, a makeshift weapon born of desperation. The intruder recovered quickly, their eyes burning with a renewed, cold fury through the holes in the mask. They lunged again, the knife slicing through the air with a deadly whistle. Elias parried the blow with the wooden splinter, the impact sending a jarring shock up his arm. The wood splintered further, but it held. For a moment, they were locked in a desperate struggle, a macabre dance of survival. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and fear. Elias fought with a strength he didn't know he possessed, driven by the pure, unadulterated will to live. He thrusted the wooden stake, aiming for the vulnerable area beneath the mask, the soft flesh of the neck. But the killer was too strong, too fast, too experienced. With a swift, brutal twist, they disarmed Elias, the wooden splinter flying across the room. The knife flashed again, finding its mark this time, sinking deep into Elias' shoulder. A scream tore from his throat, a raw, primal sound of agony. He collapsed to the floor, the fight finally draining from his body. The intruder stood over him, breathing heavily, the bloody knife held at the ready. There would be no more resistance. The end was inevitable. As the darkness closed in, Elias found a strange, terrifying peace. The struggle was over. The fear was fading. The only thing left was the cold, the silence, and the whispering shadows of the remote cabin, his final resting place. The storm raged on outside, completely indifferent to the tragic end of a life inside. The snow would continue to fall, covering the cabin, burying the tracks, hiding the horror from the world. Elias had wanted isolation, and now he would have it eternally. The blood seeped into the old wooden floorboards, a dark stain that would remain long after his body was discovered, if it ever was. The whispering shadows of the forest had claimed another victim, another lost soul who wandered too far into the unknown.